I was just very curious to know, have you tried to look at, I mean, you've done a lot of study on films division particularly. Have you tried to look at other agencies in other nations at similar times where similar work might have been going on? Or have you just, because I think, yes, looking at it within the concept and the construct of India is interesting, but also locating this output in relation to other information or documentary work, which was maybe happening in the West or other parts of Europe, could be interesting. Is that within the remit of your research?
When I was first framing this project, I did think about the possibility of doing a comparative study, and I thought about Cuba as one option, because there was a public publicity program somewhat along the lines of Films Division in Cuba, which had a very strong socialist subtext, of course. But it's what I realized was that Films Division itself is a huge topic, and that there is all this diversity and these layers of complexity within Films Division. And so I ended up narrowing it down to Films Division. And in a sense, the book that I'm working on is a book on history. It's a book on Nehruvian developmentalism. But it's at the same time, one of the very few books that will be around once it gets published on Indian documentary. And at the same time, it's also a book on development and this whole idea of studying development through film. So it really is 3 books in one already, and it's trying to break a lot of new ground, both methodologically and in terms of content. So I've decided that doing a comparative study is beyond what I can do, but I have looked at the National Film Board of Canada. I have looked at Soviet propaganda, and I've looked at a little bit what happened in some of the African countries after the British left. And you can definitely see some interesting parallels, and there's definitely a lot of scope for this kind of analysis. And that leads me to a more general point that I really do think there is just a lot of scope in continuing with this work. There's so much material in the archives. I'm really only referencing about 250, 300 films in my manuscript. There are thousands of films that the Films Division produced. There were other bodies, other organizations within India that were producing films at the same time. And you're right to point out that also internationally that was also the case. So, if anyone here is interested in research, there's just a vast scope for doing, many, many different kinds of projects with this archive. And I really do hope that this project that I'm working on is not the last one, but that it would be perhaps the first in a series of projects that people might undertake, because the material really is fascinating.
So it's all a biased version. Have you ever seen independent documentary filmmakers like Anand Patwardhan's films, which give an entirely opposite viewpoint about the development and how the poor people, they are not receiving the development?
Are you asking me if I've seen those films? Yeah, of course. I've looked at a lot of the independent cinema to contextualize the work of Films Division. I would beg to differ slightly. I think it's definitely true that there were a lot of pressures on the filmmakers in Films Division to adhere to the government line. And as I said, there was a lot of censorship, both explicit and implicit. But I think there's a certain degree to which that changes over time. And I think someone like S.N.S. Shastri was able to push the boundaries a lot further than a lot of the earlier filmmakers. To some extent, you could make the same argument about Sukhdev. So I think it's definitely true what you're saying in terms of the overall pattern, but I think there are important departures from the pattern that are interesting to look at and analyze. How do filmmakers who are trying to be subversive and who are trying to be critical, how do they function within that government setting, and how do they respond to these pressures to follow the government line? And I think you see a variety of responses to that. So I think there's some complexity around that issue as well. But of course, I don't think it ever reaches the amount of critique that you see with independent filmmakers. It would be tough to expect that would happen in a government-run organization.
The real experimentation actually happened, within the area of sound, more than the visuals. And actually, if you were to just look at the experimentation in sound, whether it's taking up advertisements of that time or the kinds of intricate, assemblage that was, and also contrary sounds which were being, put together, perhaps research could be done not only in terms of feminist critique, but also just in terms of the sound of these films, which I thought was very interesting and which, in a way, overpowers what the visual is trying to say. The visuals often ended up being more cliched and hackneyed, while it was within sound that actually the real experiments happened. I mean, this is just something that I get from looking at the work today.
It's really music, that becomes the sort of mainstream, way of thinking about having an acoustic impact on the audience. But actually, coming up with more elaborate sound designs, I think that's really Shastri's forte. And to some extent, you see that with some of the other ones as well. But you're right, there's definitely a lot of scope for research on that. As far as the extent of departure of this latter group of filmmakers, and whether or not they were engaging in a philosophical dialogue and, sort of critiquing the very foundations of Nehruvian developmentalism, I deliberately avoided speaking about my own conclusions and my own analysis because I felt it would be interesting to just leave it open-ended with those two films in the end, let everyone come to their own conclusions about that. But I do think one concept that's interesting to think about is the concept of elitism and how elitism stays or leaves the scene in films division and how it changes, all the way from the colonial times through the 50s and the 60s and into the emergency. And I would definitely go as far as argue that a lot of these films made by Sukhdev, for example, had a certain degree of elitism, in the sense that if you are basing your filmmaking on a Marxist understanding of cinema and this very strict, division of society into classes, and if you see your own purpose as a filmmaker in raising the awareness of the oppressed classes as to the oppressors and the kinds of actions that they need to take in order to escape that oppression, I think you're still very much engaging in a one-way communication with the audience. And so what I actually ended up arguing in my manuscript is that some of the changes that we see in the late 60s and the early 70s really have to do with opening up the lines of communication between the government and the filmmaker. So the filmmaker now feels more free to see the film as a feedback loop through which to inform the government as to the impact of the policies on the ground. But we don't necessarily see the same kind of opening between the filmmaker and the audience. There's still, I think, some assumptions and some power differentials there that don't fully disappear. And as far as the point about women, actually quite late in my research, I came across a whole body of films and files and documents that had to do with women. And I'm thinking about doing sort of last-minute addition to the book and just adding a small section on gender. But I think there's an entire book there. So if anyone is interested in that, I think that would be a wonderful project for someone to take up. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. What's the time?
I don't know.
Must be quite late, I think.
Yeah, but I'd like to thank Peter. And just an announcement that the THEfdZONE program will shift venues from next week. This theatre is going to undergo major renovations. So the next week's program will be on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. It's the Uranium Film Festival, which will be held in the new multipurpose hall on the ground floor. And the subsequent programs will be held in a sound theatre in the other building. We'll let you know about that next week. Thanks a lot.